So welcome to all of you to our webinar, the US elections and the coronavirus. My name is Rasmus Andresen. I'm a member of the European Parliament, and together with my colleague Reinhard Bütikofer, we are organizing this event, also because we are thinking that in a time like this, where the world is changing fundamentally, it's important also to look on the other side of the Atlantic and to get a little bit more knowledge and to discuss some transatlantic perspectives on the crisis we are facing right now. The development in the US has a huge impact on the situation in Europe, in our life here in Europe, and we can see a lot of development in the US when we are opening up for the newspaper. We are getting some information about what's going on in the US. The US economy is, for example, shrinking by about 15% of the GDP. We can see that just in 1 week, about 6 million people in the US got unemployed, and we can see that the US also is facing a huge health crisis with more than 700 people just dying alone, just alone in New York, dying through the coronavirus in the last 24 hours. So we can see a lot of bad development going on in the US, and we can see that the US is not in a normal political year, but that there will be big elections in the US in autumn this year. We will have the presidential elections, where after the progressive candidate Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race yesterday, we all know that we will have a big fight between former Vice President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. But it's not just about the presidential elections. We know that the House, under control of the Democrats right now, are up to re-election, and 1/3 of the Senate, under control of the Republicans right now, will also be up to re-election in autumn this year. So there are a lot of things to discuss, and it's the right time to look on the state of play in the US, and we would like to do that with our experts, but also with all of you. And you have the possibility to ask questions after we have heard our experts, and you can do that 2 different ways. You can look on, you can take the chat function, where you can write your question about some of the topics we will discuss right now, and then my colleague Reinhard Bütikofer will read the questions out of the chat later on in the discussion. Or you can raise your hand if you're going on the participants Teilnehmer function, where you can where there is a function where you can raise your hand. It's called raise your hand, and then you will be signaled that you want to speak, and then we will give you the floor, and you have the possibility to speak to us and to ask your question and come with your opinion about the topics we will raise later on. If you are a German participant, wenn Sie Deutsch sprechen und Probleme mit der englischen Sprache haben, dann haben Sie die Möglichkeit, über ein Pad eine schriftliche Übersetzung zu bekommen. Sie können im Chat den einen Link anklicken für die schriftliche Übersetzung, damit Sie der Debatte dann auch auf Deutsch folgen können, wenn es Ihnen schwerfällt, zu verstehen, was gleich auf Englisch von unseren Expertinnen oder von uns geäußert wird. But now I would like to hand over to my colleague Reinhard. Please, Reinhard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rasmus, and welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be able to present to you 2 of the best experts from Washington on transatlantic relations, Julie Smith and Bastian Hermisson. Julie is presently at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, the director of the Asia program, and she also serves as the geopolitics program director at the German Marshall Fund. Julie has been working in different think tanks like CSIS, but also in government over many years. She served in the Obama administration, both in the Pentagon and in the White House. She's widely published in the Washington Post, New York Times, FT, and other media. And she's certainly one of the best experts. She does understand German. She just recently spent a year in Berlin as a Weizsäcker Fellow at the Bosch Academy. I'm very grateful, Julie, that you're joining us. You're such a good longtime friend. Thanks for being with us. And then we have Bastian Hermisson. Bastian is our Green Ambassador to the United States. He's been serving as the director of the Heinrich Böll office in DC for the last 5 years. Before that, he served in a similar function in Brussels for, I think, 3 years, and also at the Böll headquarters in Berlin. Before that, he's worked in the Bundestag, and he's the one go-to person when you don't understand something about political or societal developments in the United States. Many of you will have encountered him also at some German Green Party conferences. Thank you also for joining us, Bastian. It's always a pleasure to learn from you. We have set out to do this in a very simple way. First, Julie and Bastian will give their introductions, then Rasmus and I may ask an additional question or two, and then it's up for Q&A for everybody. So I would now want to hand over to you, Julie. It's all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation today. Great to see my friends on the screen, and hope we have a good crowd of people listening in. I'll start with just a few minutes of remarks in terms of what's happening here in the United States. Very much like what's happening in Europe, the focus right now is on treating those that have the virus and preventing others from getting it. There are huge concerns about the state of our economy as well. As Reinhard noted in the opening, the jobless numbers are staggering. We're reaching a situation where we have over 16 million people filing for unemployment, which is, I mean, just takes your breath away compared to similar recessions that we've seen in the recent and not so recent past. So the headlines tend to be around what individual states are doing, how New York in particular is handling the virus, because it is the epicenter of the crisis. And there are beginning to be some longer term discussions about how we will someday at some point get the economy running again. But we know we are nowhere near out of the woods. Most places in the United States have not really reached peak outbreak yet. And that is why we feel like we're essentially in the eye of the storm. As most of you know who are listening, there has been pretty sharp criticism of the way in which the Trump administration has been handling this crisis. The criticism takes many forms. It starts primarily with the administration's failure to heed the warnings that came from the intelligence community some time ago, back in the fall of last year. But there's also been criticism about the very erratic way in which the president has handled this, where the news and the guidance changes literally from one day to the next. There has been criticism of the president for how political he's been in the distribution of precious resources, particularly PPE and ventilators and support for individual states. He himself has admitted that if he doesn't have a good relationship with a particular governor, that might actually impact the degree to which that state is receiving federal support. So that has not gone down well. He's also been widely criticized for offering a lot of conflicting guidance, both on social distancing, but also potential drugs that may or may not impact those that have picked up the virus. And then there's the kind of sideshow that's been ongoing. You've no doubt seen the news about the widely publicized crisis in the US Navy, where the commander of one of our ships, destroyer, put out a very public call for assistance, put out a call that was leaked and became public about the insufficient guidance that he was getting from the Navy about how to protect the sailors on that particular ship. He was then released of his command, was heavily criticized by the acting Secretary of the Navy, who then resigned. So this is all to say that there's a lot of other drama going on the sides, including the president's decision to let go of the Inspector General who was handling the oversight of the $2 trillion stimulus package. So in addition to the virus itself, it seems that the president and his team are continuing with some very rash decisions, again, that change by the hour, that many believe make no sense, and in some cases serve as a distraction to this crisis that we find ourselves in. Pivoting quickly just to the election, because I know that's what we really want to talk about today. Essentially, there's good news and bad news here. For Democrats, I think they're sighing relief right now. There was this expectation that we would have a contested convention, that we would actually make our way all the way to the July convention in Wisconsin and not have a clear front runner, creating total chaos in the convention venue. Of course, this was before COVID-19, but there was deep concern in the party about how that political chaos would weaken our chances of fielding a strong, unified candidate that we would put forward to battle Donald Trump. That obviously is not going to be the case now. The news broke just yesterday that Bernie Sanders has left the race. That is paving the way for Joe Biden, my former boss, to move forward with his campaign and really take the mantle and run with it. But there are still a lot of open-ended questions about our elections. Are we actually going to have an in-person convention? That's an open question. And what is going to happen on November 3rd? We cannot move the date of the election, but states do have considerable control about the procedures surrounding voting. And so there will be a difference in guidance and the way in which individual states are actually handling this election. So still tremendous uncertainty about how this is going to play out, and we may want to talk about the primary in Wisconsin and kind of how that's been mismanaged in many ways. But also there's some worry among Democrats because Trump's numbers, despite what many believe is a botched attempt to manage this crisis, seem to be holding, or in some cases even going up a little bit. And I think that probably won't be the case over the long term. We'll have to see how this plays out. But I think Democrats are right to assume that this is going to be a pretty fierce battle between Democrats and Republicans in the months ahead. It's going to be very contentious, very heated. I suspect a very aggressive, very personalized attacks, possibly on all sides. And so there's just that uncertainty is leaving a pit in many people's stomachs about how this is ultimately going to play out. And then lastly, whoever wins this election in November, whether it's a new dawn with a new president, Joe Biden, coming into the Oval Office, or if Donald Trump wins the election and gets that second term, the list of questions and challenges facing that new president or second term president is just enormous. There are open-ended questions about how the United States is going to work globally with partners and allies to return to its more traditional global leadership role. There's an open-ended question about the future of America's relationship with China going forward in the wake of this virus. And then lastly, the toughest one is how would you forge ahead with an effective recovery plan that is going to be able to help this country get back on its feet in the face of one of the most staggering recessions that we've seen in our lifetime. And this will be a long-term challenge. There are no quick fixes for this. Anyone who's sitting in that office in the Oval Office in January of next year is going to have just a breathtaking agenda before him. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now. Try to keep it a little bit concise. I know we'll dig into some of these questions into the Q&A, and thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you, Julie. Over to you, Bastian.
Thank you, Reinhard, and also thank you for the invitation from my side. Great to see you. So I want to speak a little bit about why this crisis has been hitting the US so hard, and to start maybe to dig a little bit into the international and transatlantic implications of the crisis, I mean, as far as we can guess and as far as we can see at this point. So why is this crisis hitting the US so hard? I think it is a combination of what Julie pointed out, kind of the long-term effects of the Trump administration itself, combined, I would say, with particular vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the US system, for example, the US social system and other aspects of the system. Just a few points on that. This administration over years now has been hollowed out of expertise and experts on all levels. Trump is responsible for closing the office that was responsible for battling pandemics in the National Security Council. The policy process in the White House has been broken for a long time now. It's basically unclear who's responsible. When you see these briefings with Trump, there is an array of people that are all, where it's unclear who's actually doing what. The health secretary is pretty invisible. Suddenly Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is all over the place, but supposedly doing the same thing that Mike Pence is doing. So again, the policy process is just not functional. And we've seen this over years now, and now it's having an effect on this crisis. We see a president who's more concerned with blaming others and then course correcting or ever taking on responsibility himself. And quite frankly, some of these mechanisms we saw, particularly in the first weeks, remind me more of what you see in some authoritarian regimes like China, where people are reporting to Trump and the Trump-friendly media, telling the president things he wants to hear rather than what he needs to hear, it appears, or at least he doesn't appear to be listening or have been listening. That's why it took so long in China to respond to the crisis, right? That's one of the reasons why the world is in the dire situation we're in. But that's also one of the reasons the US took so long. And it's not just a problem on the federal level. We saw this filtering down to the state level, where especially, not all of them, but especially Republican governors were repeating Trump's messages instead of listening to experts for a long time, thinking of Ron DeSantis in Florida and many others. We also see the effect of the decreasing trust in institutions that we've seen as a tendency in the US over the last years, where of course Trump himself played a big role, decreasing trust in media, decreasing trust in science, in facts and expertise, and in the government itself. And we see the effect of a polarized political climate here. Nearly everything has become an issue of partisan politics, particularly on the Republican side. We've all been witnessing this on climate change for years, where it sometimes felt like, Republicans were opposing any action, not because they felt it was the wrong thing to do, but because Democrats were for it. And in the beginning with this virus that particularly hit the East and the West Coast, Washington State, California, New York State, very Democratic areas where Democrats are strong, it seemed like there was a tendency to treat this as a Democrat issue and not as a common issue. Lastly, what I think is really hard where this is hitting so hard is that we see the vulnerabilities of the lack of a social safety net in the US, and how this virus right now is particularly hard hitting on minorities, on the Black population in the US, on the Hispanic population, on the poorest in society, on undocumented immigrants, really the vulnerable people. And those people don't vote Republican by and large. And Republican lawmakers and governments have not done much in the last years to support, the employment security for those people, to make sure that they all have access to healthcare, that the social system is prepared for that. And I'm not even speaking of the prison populations. That's a recent concern. 25% of the world's prison population is in the United States. It's an enormous amount of people that are in prison. That's a really worrisome situation. We just found out that the hotspot that most cases derived from, compared to anyone else, was actually a prison in the United States. So there's a lot of concern on that front, and all of that together basically makes for a perfect storm. Leave that with a hopeful message. Maybe I do think, many people compare this to World War II or to the Great Recession that we had before World War II in the United States. And back then was the time when we first talked about the New Deal in the United States, following the recession, and after World War II, of course, thinking about new global institutions, etc. I do think there is a chance, at least, that this will lead to a larger debate about a new social contract in the United States. Some people have talked about a Green New Deal in the last years here, particularly Bernie Sanders, but others among the Democrats as well. And I think the crisis might give some momentum to those discussions. A few words maybe on the international and transatlantic impact. I think how transatlantic relations will look in international politics in the US, in the end, will be determined by who will win politically and economically from this crisis and how they did so. So relating to what Julie said, how important these elections are. So it's not foreordained, but in the end, it depends on the actions of politicians and decision makers and how the public's going to judge it. Currently, in the immediate situation, I do think there is a lot of concern, a reason for concern about the liberal international order and global governance. We're seeing nationalist crisis management in the US, but also around the world, a scramble of kind of my country first emergency powers that are used in some countries like Hungary, already basically used to strengthen an authoritarian tendency that was there to start with. In the US, the government having used basically racist language like the China virus, the Wuhan virus, but also Germany showing less solidarity with its neighbors than I ever could have imagined in such a scenario hitting Europe. Meanwhile, China and Russia are exploiting the crisis with global propaganda and PR stunts, advocating that authoritarian systems are able to deal with this crisis more effectively and using hard and soft power to strengthen their position. And no one is talking about Huawei and 5G or Nord Stream 2 anymore, right? Like some of those issues that were so important before. We see a general lack of US leadership and an EU that is inward looking and mostly at the nation state level. We see China that is more visible in the EU than the US again. Trump is celebrating assistance from Vladimir Putin right now instead of calling his European partners, right? How often has he actually talked to his transatlantic partners on the other side of the Atlantic? And there is a loss of trust in the Western world order, I think, with the institutions failing in this decisive moment. The G7 couldn't even find a common language in this situation, which really makes you wonder, what it is still made of and how much of a backbone it has. That's all that there's a lot of cause for concern, therefore. But I do think, personally, I am tentatively hopeful nonetheless on the international and transatlantic front in the long term. If, again, that's a big if we act accordingly. And I think that starts at home, it starts here in the US, and it starts in the EU. I don't believe, for example, that China will come out of this crisis as a big global winner that some people suggest it is. Their numbers are questionable. We don't know what's actually going on in the country. But we also see that liberal democracies do have advantages in fighting this crisis. They're transparent, they're able to self-correct, they are innovative, they're open for global cooperation, potentially at least. And I don't know if China is going to be that stable if the economic growth numbers there hit them as hard as they hit some of the Western countries. Well, I think it's an open bet. We are also seeing a lot of actors that are stepping up positively, including in the United States. Julie alluded to this. The US is not just Donald Trump and the federal administration. There's a lot of governors that are stepping up to the plate, and their approval ratings are really rising. You know, Donald Trump's just a few percentage points going down again currently, but some of those governors and mayors that are now showing that leadership matters and governing matters, they're hugely rising in the polls, and I could imagine this will have an effect, that Americans will start to appreciate good governing again, good governance and expertise. You know, it was for decades, only governors were elected as president of the United States until Barack Obama came along. And I could see a return to people in the US appreciating expertise, appreciating science, you know, appreciating good governance. I also think that that the crisis could make clear how important global institutions are and leadership of the West is. Again, that the G7 plus should play a role, that the G20 should be reinvigorated. Barack Obama called a meeting of the G20 at the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, and made it an important institution again. We don't see that now, but I think there could be a push for that. And above all, realizing that we need to build global institutions after this crisis also, and reinvigorate institutions that help us tackle it, because we have to think of Africa, we have to think of Latin America, we have to think of the whole world being connected. We are in this together in the end. I think it depends on a couple of crucial factors. Number one, I'm worried about the long-term question of how the vaccine will be dealt with, if there ever is one. Will there be a nationalist rush for that vaccine that will split nations apart, possibly even within Europe, but transatlantically and around the world, or not? Could this be a point of transatlantic cooperation with potentially a new US president? Number two, again, the question of how we deal with global institutions generally after this crisis, and hopefully in managing this crisis already. Number three, of course, in the US, how this election will go. It's an even more crucial one than it was before. Will it lead to global engagement of the US again, or to America first winning out? It's an open bet. But lastly, and I want to say that since, you know, this is also very much an EU call, I think it depends on if the EU itself survives. If we cannot make it through this crisis together in Europe, the most closely knit community of nations in the world, that has the closest bonds of cooperation, then I'm very skeptical of global cooperation in the future of the world order. This is a virus that doesn't stop at the border. It's a very clear case for the need for solidarity and cooperation. And from afar, from the other side of the Atlantic, I'm a bit worried about the European response, also about Germany's role. I don't hope that Salvini is going to take over Italy and other nationalists. I don't think it's in the interest of Germany or the EU, and I really hope that we're going to learn some lessons quickly. Thank you.
Rasmus?
Yes, can start. Thanks, Bastian and Julia. I would like to add two questions to you, and you can decide, or maybe 2.5 questions, and you can decide who of you would like to answer what question, because I think you will agree on some of the question raised. If not, please feel free to discuss controversial. I think that would give a good debate at the end. For me, one of the important questions related to the domestic situation in the US right now is the economic situation. And we will talk about the economic situation and some of the packages presented and voted in Congress later in our debate. But do you think that the economy, not maybe now, but at the end in some months, could be a game changer, or will be a game changer related to the presidential elections, but also to some of the races we are looking on if it comes to the Senate or the House? That would be interesting, because as my understanding is, we can see that this is what Trump believes in, a strong economy, and this is what he campaigned on before the coronavirus came, and now that would be much more difficult, and that would be interesting for us, I think, to get your perspective on it. And on the other side, about the Democratic ticket, about Joe Biden as a nominee, I would like to get a comment from you about what do you think he should do for mobilizing some of the groups which actually had a problem with his you see some of the Sanders supporters, some of the young climate movements, some of the other progressives in the US, where we know from the elections between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that it will be important to have them mobilized for the campaign afterwards. And that would be another interesting question for us to hear a little bit more about. What kind of, maybe also to you, Bastian, this question, what kind of perspective do you see for the progressive movements in the US right now? You've talked about the Green Deal, but maybe there are other topics like the healthcare discussion. Maybe it's a more important topic now, but I don't know if you could comment a little bit on these two questions.
Okay, then I will add another question and a half. I want to echo for my first question some of what Rasmus said with regard to the economy. Couple of months ago, many pundits expected Trump to run on a strong economic story. Now, he may not be able to do that, but that does not necessarily give the Democrats that much of a fighting chance if they can't come up with their own anti-crisis policy. I recall that in 2008, Obama basically won the election against McCain because he had a plan and McCain didn't. And even though a lot of voters at the time felt that Obama might have been a bit too progressive, they still voted for the guy because that was the guy with a plan. I don't see the Democratic plan. And you mentioned the Green New Deal, Bastian, but I recall this one event that we attended, you and I, that Senator Sanders organized with AOC and a couple of experts on the Green New Deal. And at that event, and a lot of what I read is very similar, that looked as if the Green New Deal was a kind of a catch-all policy, a paradise on earth policy, and not a very specific pragmatic anti-crisis policy. So is there a chance for the Democrats really to win an economic battle, and how so? And the second question is about the international dimension. We've always been repeating that article of faith that yes, the US is more than Trump. There are the governors in progressive states like New York or California and so on, big city mayors and so. But and you mentioned them in your introductory remarks, Bastian, and said they're winning prestige and acclaim. Is there a practical way in this crisis for Europe, the European side, to team up with these people? Is there, I mean, apart from propaganda and apart from saying, yes, you're doing well and congratulations, but in practical terms, is there stuff that we could look for in order to strengthen cooperation, and by doing that also strengthen that part of America? I don't know who wants to go first. Julie?
Sure. So on the economy, I do think it's interesting to look back at 2008. For a good chunk of that year, we did have a situation where John McCain was the stronger candidate in the polls. There was a lot of uncertainty about whether or not Obama could pull it off. But you're right, as we understood the nature of the financial crisis and the tsunami that was coming and was hitting us at that moment, I think people felt like they wanted to go with the guy that was prepared to talk about it and put forward ideas. McCain kept avoiding it and wanted to continually focus on his national security credentials, which did overshadow anything that Obama had at the time in terms of foreign policy experience. But what we saw there was that the American people wanted to focus on one thing and one thing only, and that was whether or not they would have a job in a few weeks' time, and whether or not they could provide for their families. And in this case, I think the fact that the economy is cratering and that we have not seen the worst of the bad news, I think people will be turning to Trump to say, what is the plan? What will you be doing differently other than these stimulus packages? You know, what's your vision? And as Bastian noted up front, this is a team that's discombobulated. There's no policy process. People come and go. We just got a new White House chief of staff. The degree to which Trump and his team can sit and think and put forward something that will satisfy the American public that they have a plan and a vision and a detailed understanding of what's going on, I mean, I'm skeptical. Whereas Biden can come in and talk about his experience in dealing with the 2008 financial crisis. He was an indispensable player. He does have proposals up on the website. He's been putting forward ideas, not just in the face of this crisis, but how he wants to help the middle class and people that are really struggling, that are not in the middle class, that are on the lower end of the spectrum. Everyone from minorities that are struggling to all different sectors of society, people in manufacturing jobs, in industries that have disappeared, people that are going to be impacted by emerging technology, college kids that are coming out that can't find jobs, families that are struggling with the opioid crisis and the ramifications of that crisis on their cities and towns. I mean, you name it. So I think the good news is that Biden has a team around him. He has the experience and he has a process in place that resembles what happens inside government that hopefully, in my mind, will shine at a time like this and will show to the American public that actually experience matters, that process matters, that science matters, that data matters, and that you can't just put out a slogan and say America first and then blame somebody else. I don't think that strategy is going to work. I mean, the reason Trump has done all right in recent years is because from an economic standpoint, things have been holding. And in fact, the unemployment numbers have been quite good up to this crisis. And when people look at their retirement savings and they look at their 401k, they've noticed there's been a pretty serious uptick there. But now, of course, all of that is washed away. And by any indicator, the economy is in free fall. And I'm just not sure that Trump's approach of blaming somebody else, he's already talking about either the Democrats or Obama or somebody else who came before him, are the reason why he can't grapple with this challenge. And I just don't think that's going to fly at the end of the day. But to your second point, you're right to point out that Biden has some work to do to bring in the entire party and unite them around a single vision and a single plan forward. There's no question that there are disappointed Democrats out there that feel bitter and resentful that Biden is the candidate. And so they'll be looking for some sign that he's ready to meet with them, to listen to them, to shape his policies around their core concerns. He's never going to be Bernie Sanders. I mean, we cannot make Joe Biden Bernie Sanders, and we shouldn't do that. But he's right to convene groups of people, to hear from people, to meet with constituents. I think the VP selection will be very, very critical for Biden. I think it will, normally vice presidential picks don't always have a huge impact. But in this way, I think it could have an impact in terms of how he is able to unite the party and bring us together, and then hopefully later on unite the country. But it's a tall order because there are competing visions of the way forward in the Democratic Party that range from very dramatic, expensive proposals to some more pragmatic ideas, and reconciling those two visions is definitely going to be a challenge for him going forward.
I mean, I second the points that Julie makes here. The economy if you look at all indicators of whether someone is likely to win re-election or not as president, the state of the economy is the only indicator, in fact, that historically is very solid, right? If you have a very good economy and the president is up for re-election, they are going to be re-elected, basically. And only because Trump's approval ratings were so low over the last years, generally, was there any question that he, despite a strong economy, might not be re-elected. So if the economy really goes you know, isn't in such a bad state as it seems it will be in November, it's just not looking good for him. That said, this is unprecedented, and as I said before, I think it matters on the perception of the public of whether Trump managed this crisis well or not. So there's a question of the expectation and the reality as well, right? Is there how big is that gap? On Joe Biden, I also want to echo what Julie said, and that I'm a bit more optimistic comparing it to 4 years ago, because the relationship between Biden and Sanders is not the same as it was between Hillary Clinton and Sanders, and we're also at a very different state in the race right now. Sanders remained in the race against Hillary Clinton pretty much up to the convention, and the convention itself, I remember that well in Philadelphia. Reinhard, we were there together, you know, when there were Sanders protesters, very active still, you know, and Jill Stein was running around outside the convention hall, also rallying up anti-Hillary support. It was just an extremely contentious inter-party fight. And even though Joe Biden and Sanders are at very different ends of the ideological spectrum, some, or maybe not different ends, but on different, you know, they're different politically, they never had a personal contentious relationship. At least according to reports, they were both in the Senate for a time, at the same time, actually knew each other as senators. And back when Sanders was running against Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, as vice president, met with Bernie Sanders for 2 hours in his residence and said, "Good luck, by the way, Bernie." And supposedly, it's not as antagonistic between them. So I think there is a chance, with Sanders pulling out early now, that some of those divisions will heal on the personal level. That might matter. And the party overall has moved very much to the left in the last 4 years as well. Biden's platform is more leftist, if one wants to call it that now, more progressive than Hillary Clinton's was 4 years ago. But that said, sure, we had the most diverse field of candidates in the history of Democratic presidential nomination processes, right? All of these incredibly impressive women and minority candidates and all that. And now we have Joe Biden that we could have seen coming from the get-go. So there is a lot of frustration. And it'll be tough, but I just don't think it's the same as 4 years ago. I also think that any Democratic voter knows that every vote matters. And 4 years ago, there were so many Sanders you know, supporters that thought Clinton would win anyway, and they stayed home or they voted third party. A lot more is at stake now with every vote, and I think people are more aware of that. So I'm, you know, slightly more optimistic from a Democratic point of view. The Green New Deal, Reinhard, as you mentioned, sure, that wasn't a defined program. It still isn't to this day, and I don't really think Joe Biden is going to call it a Green New Deal now and adopt it to that extent. But there was elements in the Green New Deal debate that I think might resurface, and that also even the Biden campaign might look at anew. How do we build a sustainable social safety net? I mean, what we're doing now in the stimulus packages here, and the bailout packages, reform on unemployment insurance, on extra family leave time, you know, on support for vulnerable communities, it's not going far enough at all. But it's remarkable. It's something new for the US, and I think there is a room for a debate on a social safety net that is new. There is room for more public debate and support for jobs programs, including potentially government-supported major infrastructure programs. We've been talking about them for years. I think it's not unthinkable that that kind of thing might happen. It's not I don't see the perfect plan yet. Why not, to your question? I don't see anyone advocating the 10-point plan at this point. But I think there is a chance that we'll have a much more substantial debate and openness to specific reforms on social security, on jobs programs, and on the kinds of industries that, you know, Democratic administration might want to support into the future. One question on the governors: what can we do across the Atlantic? I mean, I can't think of a lot of ways to specifically work together outside of the Trump administration. It's not quite comparable to climate, where actually a lot has happened in the last years on the state and local level. Like real action has happened between California and Baden-Württemberg and others, for example. But one thing I could think of is scientific exchange and cooperation. where there is so much happening already around the world, and it's really worth to look at, clusters of universities across the Atlantic also working together on vaccines and on treatment options and developing medical safety gear that is needed. And the other thing is, I really wish that every mayor right now would pick up the phone and call their sister city in support across the EU and also in the US. Every major city in the US has a sister city in Germany. This is the time to show solidarity because it matters. It might not be very specific on policy, but these signs of solidarity in a time when everyone's saying America first, my country first, really does matter.
Reinhard, could you start with some written questions? Reinhard?
I think he's on mute now. We can't hear you.
I'm unmuted now.
There you go.
I have a couple of questions that I'm going to read to you, and one is on Trump's crisis management or lack thereof, or whatever you want to call it. Tabitha remarks that Trump is actually blaming WHO for his lack of action on the COVID-19 crisis. If he wins the election, U.S. relations with the international community will continue to deteriorate. So that question goes into the direction of his approach of blaming the international arena. And the second question, in a similar direction, somebody, Danny, points out that there is a growing racism among the population, and he highlights in particular Trump's usage of the phrase China virus. And then there is, so maybe one of you, or either both, or one of you would want to address that dimension, that approach of the president to try to frame the conversation over the crisis in the terms that he likes best, the us against them terms, the exclusionist approach that he, the blame that he puts on external forces. How does that play out? How is his chance of winning that kind of conversation? And the second, another question, it goes to Bastian. What do you think? Will this crisis hurt Trump's campaign, or will it lead, or will it result in moderates rallying around the flag and the president, or doesn't it really change a lot in the dynamics because there is a high polarization of US society anyhow? And then there are a couple of questions on energy policy, but I would put that back for the time being.
Well, I'm happy to take the questions about blame. I mean, Trump has a playbook that's worked very well for him, both as a business leader and as president, and that is to immediately place blame on someone or something for anything that's gone wrong, and chants of lock her up, surface during the Republican convention in 2016. I mean, it's always somebody to punish, always somebody to lock up, somebody to take away, to drag out of the room, and you can't do that with a virus. I mean, you can't blame the virus, and you can't lock up a virus. And so what the president has decided to do is essentially blame the country where the virus originated, and label the virus the China virus or the Wuhan virus, immediately then triggering racist incidents across the United States, as well have been well documented. And then it swings from one person to the next. I mean, he's been blaming the impeachment process, but he's also not afraid to blame the WHO and they're mishandling it. And to be sure, don't get me wrong, I mean, the WHO is not an angel in this story. Mistakes have been made. And they've had almost an uncanny or curious kind of pro-China stance on this from day one, which tells you a lot about the inroads the Chinese have made inside that organization and the amount of influence and power they have inside the WHO. But yes, this is a typical playbook that is used by the president. The degree to which it's working, I have my doubts. I think people don't want blame anymore. They want answers, and they want to know when their governor's going to get PPE and ventilators, and they want to know when they're going to get that check that's been promised. I mean, the amount of red tape in this country to really get people the assistance they need is pretty amazing. It's very hard for our government to churn out this assistance. It has not gone as smoothly as, say, a country like Canada that was able to do direct deposits into individuals' accounts. So folks are desperate. Their relatives and friends and family are getting the virus. Some are dying. Many are very, very sick. And to have Trump stand up day after day and talk about impeachment in the Democrats, obviously with some supporters, that's going to play beautifully and nothing will ever change their mind. But I think, look, let's remember that this election was not won by a huge margin. In fact, Trump lost the popular vote. And in certain states like Michigan, the margin by which he won was only, 11 or 12,000 votes. So for Democrats to win, they don't have to convince every Trump supporter to abandon the president. They just wouldn't succeed in doing that. But what they have to do is, and what Joe Biden now has to do, is to get the people that are fed up and tired of the games and tired of the blame and everything else that they've seen in recent years, and just get them to cross back over. The people that voted for Obama twice and then switched to Trump, we need those independents and some of those Republican suburban moms to come back over, and we need to rally our own party and get turnout out. And make sure it's high for the election. But so the long story short is, yes, it was a good question. The president is doing everything he can every day to go like this and blame somebody in the room or someone across America or around the world for this. But I'm just not sure, as this crisis gets darker, whether or not the American people are going to find that satisfactory.
Okay, should I take two? I have two on the speakers list now. Maybe I can.
Bastian, would you want to add anything?
I'm sorry. Yeah, of course.
Just maybe the one point on rallying around the flag, but it's, I mean, so we saw Trump's approval ratings rise a few percentage points afterwards, not as much as in a lot of other countries where people really rally around the executive at this time. I think some of that is a kind of rally around the flag effect in a crisis. I think a lot of it is also that people are afraid. When people are afraid, they want to believe that they have a leadership that is responsible and that will make good decisions. I think it's a natural instinct. It might hold and it might benefit him in the election. I'm not so sure. The one thing, though, I want to say that's going to be difficult for the Democrats that we haven't talked about is the very practicality of campaigning during these times. So, I mean, again, I don't think Trump is in the best position because people are seeing and increasingly seeing the huge lines outside of the food banks here. They're seeing millions of their neighbors and of people losing their jobs. And for one, the Republican talking point that you're responsible for your own economic success or not is not working. because everyone knows it's not their fault that they just lost their jobs, right? And they need assistance. So I think overall Trump is not in a good shape in that sense. But for the Democrats, campaigning will be so difficult because, I mean, you can't do handshakes, you can't do rallies. The Democrats and Joe Biden have a huge deficit on Trump financially when it comes to them doing, online marketing and, TV advertisements and all of that. And they are lacking a lot of the fundraising tools that are dependent on person-to-person, interactions. They can't do door-to-door campaigning called canvassing. They can't do voter registrations out, in the malls or somewhere downtown where they, try to get new voters on the polls. And lastly, they're afraid that Republicans are going to do everything to keep mail-in ballots, so ballot by mail, from being nationwide, to basically do everything to suppress the vote because they think they will benefit from that electorally. And indeed, it could be to the detriment of Democrats if people are still dependent to go to the polls, possibly with an ID on that Tuesday itself. So in that sense, I think it will be a tough situation for the Democrats to get media attention if Joe Biden is sitting in his house in Delaware, and you can't dominate the news, register voters, get out the vote, mobilize people. All that's going to be very, very hard.
Okay.
Okay, then I have some on the speakers list, maybe to explain the system once again. You can, if you want to talk and to ask your question, then you can use the participants function and then go to the raise hand button, and then we will see that you would like to ask something, and then you will get the floor after each other. And the first one on my list is Elisabeth Horstkötter, and it's really important that we will unmute you, but you also have to do that in your system. So you have to click on the microphone button. But Elisabeth, you are the first one. I think you can speak now. Okay, then we try.
Rasmus,
yeah, Elisabeth.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry,
yes.
I didn't ask for the floor, so it seems to be a mistake, and I'm just listening. Sorry.
Okay, but
it's quite interesting. Sorry.
Then you're the test person, and the system works. That's good to know. The next one would be Bobby Winkler. Bobby.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello, Rasmus. Hello,
hey.
Bobby Winkler, a New Yorker in Flensburg. Certain things have occurred to me. The first is the strong economy, and the question is for whom a strong economy? It seems to me the fault lines in the American society have become visible, but they didn't begin on the 20th of January 2017. If it's economic inequality or healthcare or education or college debt. And when we look at the election in November, we have had voter suppression going on now, not just now, but for a while now, where we can actually ask how democratic with a small d is the United States. And we have to look at the Senate race, because even if we get a Democrat into the White House, if the Republicans keep control of the Senate, you have the question of who approves nomination to the Supreme Court. If McConnell gets reelected in Kentucky, and is majority leader, will he say, I'm sorry, we have to wait until 2024 because for that a president can't nominate anybody for the Supreme Court, as he did in 2016. So the question is, what's going to happen, even if the Democrats should, and I hopefully will, win the White House, and we seem to focus on that and not necessarily on the Senate and other things, and states have complete control of how they decide to do this. Even the ballot between Westchester County and New York City is different. The opening hours are different. There's no standard ballot. There's no standard opening times, even within the various within a state. And I think this is something that Europeans and Germans have problems. They can't get their head around it, quite frankly. And it leads to the question of, is America really a democracy?
Thank you, Bobby. Julia, would you like to start?
Well, yeah, that's a couple of different issues. So I don't know where to start. So maybe, I mean, I don't disagree with what you've laid out here. I mean, I do think you're right to point out that folks are heavily focused on winning the White House, and the priority seems to be across the board. Let's make sure that we can, for Democrats, let's make sure that we can beat Donald Trump. But you're right to point out that there are important Senate races. And as Obama himself learned, it's difficult to get Congress to work with you, even sometimes when your party controls both houses. And it's really difficult to get stuff done when your party doesn't control one house or the other, or in the worst case scenario, doesn't control either house. So we do have to focus on those elections as well, and the control and the power that still rests in those Senate positions and those House positions as well. And then, as you noted, back in the states, because so much is determined at the state level, and we're witnessing that right now, both in terms of how they're responding to the fact that it's an election year and how they're responding to the coronavirus. So yeah, it's no question that the world looks at it with, shrugged eyebrows, raised eyebrows, and shrugged shoulders, trying to make sense of what is going on here. But it is revealing a lot about American society, about the socioeconomic gap that exists in this country, the widening gap, the smaller middle class, and the large polls on both ends, those with tremendous resources and those with no resources at all. And my hope is that the severity of this crisis will finally enable the next president to enact legislation and make some changes that would close that ever widening divide. The system cannot go on as is. And so we just have to hope that there's very few silver linings coming out of this crisis. But one might be a stronger U.S. social safety net, which will by no means ever resemble what actually exists in Europe. The U.S. will never be Europe, full stop. But I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from our European friends, and some practices, obviously, that we should and can adopt to address the severity of the gap between these two poles in our society.
Bastian, may I add a question to the question asked from Bobby? Do you see a debate about, for example, also the electoral system in the US, in the bigger picture, in US politics? I know that some of the candidates in the Democratic Party had tried to raise the debate, but after some of them dropped out, I'm not sure about if there still is a debate going on, if that was something maybe in the Democratic primaries, but not on the bigger picture in US politics. So really like to hear a comment to that, and then also, of course, to the question of Bobby.
I mean, there have been a lot of debates in the last years and for a long time, really, about the electoral systems in the United States. Whether it is that election day should be a federal holiday, at different times there was a lot of support for that, and should not be on a working day, when, again, particularly people that are in vulnerable jobs just cannot afford to go vote oftentimes. Or whether it's getting rid of the electoral college system when it comes to electing the presidency and going to a system where really every vote matters in the same way throughout the United States, and you don't give a disproportional power to states that have the least population, basically. The same, ideas to make the Washington, D.C., a full-fledged state. We live here in Washington, 600,000 people that don't have any representation in Congress, and therefore is the balance of the Senate representative. So there's a lot of debates like that. It's just that I think right now in this crisis there is going to be less bandwidth than ever to actually get into those debates. I think the focus right now, and probably rightly so in this immediate debate, is how can we protect the election that we are facing. How can we protect it from disinformation, including foreign disinformation? I mean, we've already finding out Russian disinformation connected to the corona crisis itself that is being spread in Europe and the United States. You know, and of course, you know, other countries also that are doing disinformation campaigns and are trying to impact the US election. And this was mentioned in the question, voter suppression. How can we guarantee access in the United States to as many people as possible to go vote? And those will be the big fights this year. There is a whole number of states where those fights are very current. The most recent was this week in Wisconsin, where the primary in Wisconsin was held on Tuesday, an in-person primary at the same time that there's a stay-at-home order in the state. It's one of the most absurd things you can imagine. The Democratic governor wanted to say, no, let's push this back a little bit and enable people to vote by mail for another couple of weeks and then count the votes. And the Republican-dominated legislature said, no, we're going to have this because they thought the less people vote, the more likely it is that they're going to have success with pushing through a conservative judge in these state elections. There's a lot of battles like that going on nationwide, and that is the focus right now. So long story short, yes, there is, and I mean, I think there have been for a long time debates on more wide-ranging electoral reforms. They have never really gotten hold because you always need bipartisan support for those major changes. But right now, I think the main focus is and will be for the next months on very specific questions of protecting these elections. For example, in the next bailout package that is already being discussed in Congress, one of the questions is if the Democrats should combine these economic bailouts to provisions to widen mail-in ballots possibilities for the election in November, which again, Donald Trump heavily proposed. He just said this week that mail-in ballots are per se corrupt, and then was confronted with the fact that he himself last fall did mail-in, voted by mail in his newly elected home state of Florida. But that's the reality we live in.
I have a couple of questions that have been sent in, and I would like to read them to Bastian and to Julie. And they all focus on the political process. So one question is to Julie directly. You mentioned, Keith asks this, you mentioned that the states have some control over the election process. Could you elaborate on this? If November 3rd cannot under any circumstances be postponed, what options do states have? That's question number one. Somebody asks, who do you think will be among the people the Biden campaign is considering for the vice president role? This is from Mara. Who do you think would be a good pick for the VP? Then somebody Robert raises a question regarding a point that Bastian already addressed a little bit. Under the present circumstances, how can Democrats most effectively Trump's culpability on Main Street and make a difference? Then Mara again asks, do you think the coronavirus crisis will leave behind a more polarized US or a less polarized US? And the last question I will read to you is from Till. Till says, how big is the risk of polarization leading even to social unrest? How might Trump react if pressure on him increases? What indicators do you suggest to follow to keep track? Bastian, maybe you start this time.
Should I start?
You don't have to address them all, just the ones that you like best.
Sure. Yeah,
and then Julie takes the rest.
Those are all very good questions. Who should Joe Biden pick as VP? I mean, gee, I don't know. He said that it would be a woman. That reminded me a little bit of Norbert Röttgen saying, I'm going to pick a woman. I was like, well, it should be a little bit more specific, right? Like there's a lot of really tough and strong and powerful women out there. But but of course he can't say yet who it is. So, but it will be a woman. You know, Kamala Harris was floated as an option. Of course, Elizabeth Warren would be, you know, a real kind of olive branch over to the Sanders supporters on an ideological level. But I think in the current state, it's also entirely possible that he'll pick a strong governor, like the governor of Michigan, you know, that are suddenly coming to the forefront and that are showing some executive experience. I don't know. We'll see. I'd be interested to hear what Julie thinks of that. And maybe on the question of solidarity, are we going to see more or less solidarity and no, not solidarity, frictures in society, right? Are they going to deepen or not? I mean, I think it's an open bet. Trump is continuing with the politics of fear and the politics of anger and of division. As Julie said, that's his playbook. He doesn't know another playbook to follow. He's followed this his whole life. And we'll see if he wins. But he's going to have an opponent in Joe Biden and the Democratic Party that I'm convinced is going to do the politics of empathy, of compassion, and of solidarity. And if that wins, I think it's not going to be a game changer from one day to the next, but it could be a certain game changer, because what we see right now is, on the one hand, a federal government that is dividing people, dividing nations, again, doing these kind of politics. And we see a society here in the US, just very practically, and I hear this from all over the country, that people are experiencing an enormous amount of solidarity, of helping each other, of being there for each other, of civil society really springing into action, and of almost a need of, we're in this together. It's kind of absurd. On the one hand, everyone's apart, right? So I also don't think you're going to have a lot of social unrest and social distancing at the same time. That doesn't quite seem to match. But being apart might very well make people be aware of the fact that they're closer together and of the need to be one, you know, one people. So I, you know, it's more anecdotal. I don't have statistics to prove this. Can imagine that some of those politics of fear, of hate, and of division are not going to be as popular afterwards as they were. But of course, it's an open bet.
Okay, so there was a question about states and their role in this process. So you can change, I mean, the date of the election is written in stone. You would need, it would take heaven and earth to change the date. It will not happen. We're not going to change the date of the election. So many stars would have to be aligned for us to make that change. I mean, it's unimaginable. But states do have control over the procedures, and there you're going to see a wide array of ways in which states are handling how to vote in the middle of a global pandemic. We did go forward with that election in 1918 during the Spanish flu, so there is some precedence for holding elections in the middle of a massive health crisis. But there are lots of ideas on the tools that states can use to cope with this situation and keep people safe. So right now, we've had 17 different states come forward and suggest absentee voting. But this is not something generally that Republicans like, because turnout often favors Democratic candidates. And Republicans are spinning this story that there's voter fraud involved with sending in absentee votes that could be double counted or miscounted or sent back by accident. You'll notice in the last couple of days, Trump has said a lot about this. If you fact check a lot of his statements on absentee voting, a lot of it is complete mythology. We do not have a massive problem with voter fraud in this sense. We have other challenges with our system, but this is not one that kind of keeps me awake at night. So I think absentee voting is a viable solution, but it will come from states themselves to determine whether or not they want to move forward with this. Now, others like Elizabeth Warren are putting forward bolder ideas that we need national mechanisms in place to cope with voting during this pandemic. And I'm not super optimistic that some of those will really go anywhere, again, because of the Republican-controlled Senate that has other ideas. But we'll have to see how that unfolds in the weeks ahead, and also how our numbers, you know, if the virus starts to trail off but then comes back with a vengeance in the fall, maybe there'll be more of a movement to look at measures like this. I'm not sure, but that gives you a sense of kind of what we're up against at this point, and how you're going to have different policies. I mean, we still have states that are allowing people to go to church on Easter. So, I mean, there's just all sorts of views on social distancing and when the restrictions should be lifted and whether or not people are at risk to go vote. And so it's a whole patchwork quilt of ideas and proposals. The other question, well, I'm going to skip the VP pick. I mean, we can sit here and speculate all day, but all we know right now is it will be a woman, which I'm very excited about. But as Bastian said, you should not just think about women that were running for president, you should think about the array of women that are out there as governors, as business leaders, as state and local leaders. I mean, there's all sorts of women. So don't assume that it will necessarily, it could be, but it will necessarily be someone who competed with Biden in the presidential race. And then a more polarized society, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, in some ways, Bastian's right. Cities and towns are coming together in ways that you just cannot imagine, to support the people that are on the front lines, but also to support people in their community. I would hope that we could take the more optimistic spin and say that this will lead to slightly less polarization across society, but politically, I mean, it's the divides are deep, and there are a lot of people out there that are still on social media every night talking about why one side or the other is right or to be blamed. And what you can find right now on Twitter or Facebook from both sides of the aisle is a little bit horrifying. And I just think we can't sweep that under the rug. I would hope that maybe Biden over time could at least bring some parts of the country back together. The last thing I'll say is that Americans are exhausted and they are a bit tired of fighting each other. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to stop, but there is this feeling of like, you know, if only Trump would stop tweeting, and even some of his supporters will say that, like, this is draining. You know, we don't need this every day of our lives. So one would hope that this will be some cycle that at some point we'll see an improvement.
Okay, thanks. I have one more on the speakers list, and it's Pietro, I guess it's the right way to spell it.
And then I also have more written questions later.
Hello.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, this is Peter Fiocchi from Italy. I'm a member of the European Parliament, ECR group. For Bastian, I'm not part of Salvini's party. I have some question more on the relationship between the EU and the United States, and with reference to the pending elections. Number one, one of the things I noticed that governments are repossessing strategic production due to the coronavirus crisis. For example, you know, the production of face masks that before we were importing from China, oxygen bottles, military equipment, and so on. And so they're setting up defenses on national companies that they find as strategic. So, do you see a medium-term decrease in international commerce and financial exchange between the US and Europe as a result of the coronavirus? Second question, of course, this is a health and human crisis, then an economic shock, but it's also a political crisis. In Italy, 58% of the citizens are not happy with Europe. Plus, Italy is, from an economic point of view, is in a very bad shape, with potentially the debt to GNP ratio going to 160%. So there is a remote possibility of an Italy exit. which could cause a crash of Europe. How do you see a transatlantic relationship without the EU, but all the European members playing by themselves? And last, how do you see NATO emerging from this coronavirus? Whatever happens in the presidential election, either Trump or not Trump. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have one written question from Claudia that goes in the same direction as your first question. She writes, I think we should talk about the globalized supply chain and the relocation issue. And I would want to put that into the context of the decoupling strategy that has been pursued over the last year or so in many circles in Washington that advocate that the United States should, to a certain degree, decouple from China. So what does the corona experience possibly change in that regard? This has been a topic that Trump has been pushing for quite some time. So could that benefit him, or would it benefit the Democrats?
Okay. So on the European Union, the question about the European Union, I mean, certainly with this president, we're in a pretty unique situation. I mean, historically, back since the creation of the EU, American presidents have been supporters of the European project. They were, in part, the United States was present at the creation and certainly tried to do its part to support that creation and help nudge it along. We're not a member of the EU, but again, historically, we've been supporters of it, even as we've had contentious issues to deal with and friction in our trade relationship and all the rest. That's changed with the Trump administration that has taken a much more aggressive posture towards the European Union. The president has actually called the European Union, as you well know, a foe. And he has actually asked other European countries whether or not they would consider pursuing some sort of exit of their own. He is a supporter of Brexit. He's been largely tutored on the European Union by Nigel Farage, one of the stronger Brexiteers, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So I have been disheartened to see this US president essentially discount America's relationship with the European Union. I was deeply frustrated when he announced the European travel ban in the first few days of this crisis without any consultation with our European allies. I would hope that this crisis could bring the EU and the US closer together to talk about ways in which we can be grappling with the aftermath of this crisis, or even ways in which we could talk about how we're going to all mass distribute and mass produce the vaccine and ensure that some of the poorer countries around the world can get access to that vaccine in the same way that richer countries can. That's obviously a question for the G20 and the G7 as well, but the EU-US relationship plays a critical role here. So if Joe Biden were to be elected president, I think you could expect to see a U-turn in US policy towards the European Union. I think you would see that president extend a hand to the European Union, put forward concrete ideas on how we can work together and strengthen, not weaken, our trade relationship, and stop badgering allies on things like 5G, and instead see if we can work together on some sort of joint approach instead of just issuing orders as to what our European friends should and should not be doing. Which kind of comes to Reinhard's question about decoupling. I mean, this is a term that has been thrown around by some members of the administration and some folks across Washington. It's not universally accepted, but I think there is this perception somehow in Washington that this is viable, that the United States actually could decouple from China. My experience spending a year in Berlin talking to many people about this is that no one in Europe or Germany would be prepared to pursue that, possibly even in the wake of this crisis. I think we do have to have a conversation about global supply chains and how we're managing the rise of China on multiple fronts. And we're only beginning to wrap our heads around that. But I guess I don't see a situation where Germany is really going to do much to jeopardize this very valuable trading relationship with China. That doesn't say there isn't much more we could be doing together. I mean, there's a lot more we could be doing together, but I think framing it in decoupling probably is not the right way to go.
Bastian, maybe I can add a question before you are answering the question from the colleague from Italy. I would like to hear, because you mentioned the Green New Deal at the beginning, and you spoke about that maybe there could be created a momentum for a Green New Deal in the US. And if you're looking on the plans Joe Biden has, if we will end up with a President Joe Biden at the end, do you think there would be a new momentum for new development in the transatlantic partnership? Or do you believe that it would be more of the same of what we saw before Trump was elected as president?
Just very briefly, Pietro, I also want to say, like, that of course we're all thinking of Italy in this situation, right? Like the world seems very focused on the US right now because there's the most cases, etc. But if you look per capita, like Italy is of course in a much worse state than the United States, and it's I think you know, a time where we really wish you all the best. I just wanted to add one thing to where I am somewhat pessimistic also to what Julie had said, that I think a tendency that we saw before of increasing nationalization of discourse, viewing certain industries as questions of national security. This is something that Trump has supported for years and has justified certain policies with national security reasons, like, you know, treating the automobile industry as a national security issue, etc. They were very questionable, but it's not just a US phenomenon. I think we've seen this tendency in Europe as well, and I am concerned that this crisis will increase that trend, that increasingly we're going to view different industries as industries where we need national supply chains, you know, where politics says these are all questions of national security in the end. And I sincerely hope that at least on the EU level, we're going to manage to have EU answers to those questions. And I would hope that it doesn't lead to a major reshifting of globalization and global trade routes in general. I do think global trade and trading relationships around the world are important if they're done well and take, you know, social rights and environmental concerns into consideration, because they do bring us closer together. So I am concerned on that front, increasing nationalization. And on the Green New Deal, so if I only think about the environmental side, it's not going to be the same as it is under this current administration. I mean, the current administration, the Trump administration, even in the midst of this crisis, is spending political capital and energy on the further deregulation of environmental rules. The latest was last week, the decision to, against the interests of the US car industry, to weaken fuel emission standards for cars in the United States. Even most American automobile makers do not want this, because that's not how the global market works anymore. That's not how they can sell their cars in California either, which has stricter standards. So, but this administration is obsessed with that. The EPA, that's supposed to protect the environment, has been hollowed out and has really been used as a deregulation agency, you know, over the last years, with an incredibly low morale of the staff working there. I could tell you endless horror stories from an environmental perspective. Joe Biden is very different. He worked on the Paris Agreement back in the day. Yeah, he's was also part of including climate support for renewable energies, for example, in the bailout package 2007-2008 that the Obama administration initiated back then. So it's not like he's an anti-environmentalist. However, we should also not think that everything's going to be hunky-dory between environmental-minded Europeans and the Biden administration. There will continue to be contentious issues. Biden has been against the moratorium on gas fracking. It's a big issue in his, home state of Pennsylvania, and in other Midwestern states where he thinks electorally it's important to show his support to continue fracking because a lot of jobs and potentially a lot of votes depend on that. That will only get more intense with the oil prices falling currently and a lot of fracking industries coming under extreme pressure in the United States, a lot of jobs being lost in that. There'll be pressure on Biden to say he's supporting those fossil fuel industries also moving forward, at least protecting the jobs. That could be contentious. So it's not like the US is going to turn into a green governed country all of a sudden with the election, but it will be a game changer. That doesn't mean we will not have a partnership. We might still, tug in some different directions on solutions and definitely debate about the speed at which we want to move ahead. But the general point that climate change is one of the major issues, if not the major issue that humanity faces. We need a global answer, and the US needs to be a leader at home and abroad. That is something where there's going to be shared agreement with the Biden administration. And for the sake of this planet and my children and the children, of this world, there's a lot at stake in that respect in this election.
Thanks to both of you. I have a couple more questions that have been sent in, and then I would also want to ask one or two from my own side. Do you have any, Rasmus, that you want to have first?
No, not now.
Then I quote a question that's been sent in. How can it be assured that the election process and the outcome will not be interfered with, for instance, by Russia? Do we have to expect that Trump will contest the results if he loses? Then a couple of policy questions. One is, which of the policies that Sanders advocated would you expect to end up playing a major role in Biden's campaign? Healthcare for all, he wasn't so fond of, if I got it right. Student loan, what is it? I mean, in a way, he has to show the Sanderistas that they're not just expected to vote holding their noses, but that there is a reason for them to get active. And what could Biden pick up from that? And then on EPA that you just mentioned, Bastian, I haven't seen much on the side of the Democrats pushing back against the deregulation that the Trump administration has pushed regarding EPA. So is that going to play a role? Spotted owl and all the age-old environmental protection legislation going back all the way to Nixon is now cast aside. Is that going to play a role? I recall that in 2000, Gore didn't dare raising green issues during his campaign. Will it be different with Biden, or will he just hope that he would have that kind of vote anyhow? And then on foreign policy, which kind of foreign policy issues do you expect to play a role in this campaign? China? Anything else?
Julie, should I start or?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, I'm still writing stuff down. Yes, go ahead.
That's a lot of questions. One of the really important ones that was asked, I think, is, and the yet that no one has an answer to is, would Trump concede the election if he fails, right? Because in my view, from Trump's perspective, it's not just about an election. It's about the possibility that he and a lot of his family and his cronies might actually end up in jail at some point. If some of those lawsuits that are pending, you know, and all of the other stuff that might come to light once he's not protected by the presidency anymore, what that could lead to. So from the perspective of Trump, I think it is an existential question, this election. It is not just a question of narcissism and electoral success or defeat. It is quite existential. And I find it hard to believe that he would just concede gracefully the night of the election under those circumstances. That said, I can't tell you what the scenario would be if he doesn't. I mean, the rules are very clear. I cannot conceive at this point. We have a functioning liberal democracy in the US still. We have an independent judiciary. We have, you know, we have a Congress that has, you know, controlling functions of the executive. You know, we have, you know, security, you know, institutions like the police, the National Guard, the military that are still, you know, mostly run by people that believe in the Constitution, that have all sworn an oath on the Constitution and not a personal oath to Donald Trump, you know, as a person. I don't want to believe that we could end up in a much more serious situation, but at the same time, I also don't think there'll be an easy Trump will just concede the night of the election gracefully. So it might be very contentious. In the end, though, I think I'm hopeful that he would be forced to concede by Republicans in the Senate or the Supreme Court, if need be. On climate, Reinhard, I don't want to be too optimistic that environmental issues or the climate will play a major role in this election. Because everything else, because the crisis is just overshadowing economic issues, are going to be overshadowing a lot of other issues for American voters right now. It's really about, how do I pay my rent? How do I keep my job? What is the future of my industry going to be like? How can I have health insurance? You know, so healthcare might very well be a top concern. Environmental issues, I don't quite see it, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a major issue in the next administration, because climate change is not going away, right? It's not an issue that just happens to be en vogue because people happen to talk about it. It's an issue that is en vogue because it's real and people feel it, and people, you know, feel the result of extreme weather events throughout the US even more so than they do in Europe. You know, they feel the event on the agricultural industry in the US already. And so I think the next administration, if it is a Democratic one, which is open, of course, but if it is, climate policy and environmental policies will play a larger role. We saw in the last midterm elections that for Democratic voters, climate was the #2 issue as far as their concern is concerned, of their concerns. I don't know how much that has changed now with the Corona crisis as we speak, but it goes to show how salient of an issue it has become in the minds of Democratic voters. And by the way, also of younger Republican voters, where you see a big generational shift, and younger Republican voters are also overall concerned about, you know, about climate policy. So I do think something will change in that respect. On foreign policy, I might leave it to Julie, but just say I think the 2 main points of the election, China, as you mentioned, and I think overall the international role of the US does the US define itself as a country that wants to be a global leader? A leader of alliances, a leader of institutions, institution building and preserving institutions, or does it want to go it alone? On that broad narrative, I think it will play very much of a role, especially between Trump and Biden, who are very much at 2 ends of the spectrum. The EU, I don't know if we'll hear that much about it in the coming election.
Okay, so yeah, Bastian entered or addressed the contested election result. I mean, I do think it is one scenario where Trump declares that some part of the election is fraudulent, and then he determines that we either need to delay the outcome, or we could go back to the 2004 scenario where we had hanging chads and people counting paper ballots and the Supreme Court getting involved, or he could just repeatedly say it's fraudulent and hope that his supporters in Congress rally around him. But one has to hope at that point that the checks and balances kick into high gear, and we know what to do as a country with a president who refuses to leave. But this is going to be a major point of pride for him. If he loses, this will be very hard for him to swallow, despite the fact that he will try to blame it again on some aspect of the election that was unfair to him. But, you know, it's probably not a huge chance of this happening, but I think it's more likely to happen than with any other prior presidential election. So something to watch. On policies that Biden can accept from Sanders, I mean, as Bastian had noted earlier in the discussion, Biden has already moved to the left from where he was, say, in 2008 and other prior runs that he's had for president. And I think that is the result of being up against some really tough challengers. Both Warren and Sanders were very effective in putting pressure on Biden and asking some hard questions, forcing him to revisit some of his positions and altering them to respond to the progressive demands that exist across the party today. The Democratic Party is different than it was just a few years ago, not to mention 20 years ago. And he understands that, and he is trying to be responsive to those requests and desires. And already he has adopted some of Sanders' policies on education, where college tuition would be free if the family budget was below, say, I think the cap is $125,000 a year. And then if I'm not mistaken, I think he adopted some of the policies that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren had put forward on bankruptcy and debt forgiveness. But I'm not an economist, and I don't work on domestic issues. I only work on foreign policy. So those are worth fact checking. But I do believe that Bernie Sanders, when he dropped out of the race yesterday, was able to legitimately step back and feel like he had had a major outcome on the platform that Biden is going to be putting forward this fall when he runs against Donald Trump. Lastly, on foreign policy, our elections are never decided on foreign policy, ever. And so I'm used to my issues mattering less than domestic issues like education and immigration and healthcare. That won't be any different this time. In fact, the scales will be tipped probably more so towards domestic issues because of the very dire economic straits that we're going to find ourselves in. We already find ourselves in, and the dark clouds that are looming on the horizon. So foreign policy is just not, I think, going to play heavily in this debate. Biden will want to do his best to point out the many shortcomings of this administration on foreign policy and won't miss a chance to do that. But I think voters aren't going to really care that much about their differences on North Korea or China or Iran, even though there are real differences. But I think it'll have a minimal impact. The only exception to that might be, as Bastian kind of hinted at, this question of the forever war. If you haven't read it yet, Ben Rhodes came out with a piece this week that said it was the end of the 9/11 era. I think that's true in the sense that 9/11 and terrorism has kind of defined U.S. foreign policy since 2001. And I think we're entering a world now where security is going to be broadly defined. Americans on the left and the right want to do less in the world. And we will have a deeper discussion, I think, about how we define security and how America engages in the world more broadly.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Bastian. We're coming to the closing remarks now from me and from Reinhard afterwards. Thanks for the good discussion to all of you. I think we should develop that and go on with it maybe to a later time in the year, because we need some transatlantic discussions about things going on in the US, but also in the European Union, because I think we are better off together, and you will have some big and important elections in the US in the coming months, but we are also having some big policy questions here in Europe we have to face together. And I think we should try to build a new chapter of transatlantic collaboration for the next years. And of course, events like that, like this tonight can be a part of that. And for me, it's not just about big politics and about the questions who will win the Senate in November, who will be the next president. Of course, that's very important questions, and I think we've learned a lot of your expertise today, but it's also about developing transatlantic cooperation on different levels, like on NGO level, like on from members of the European Parliament to members of the Congress in the US, but also on the city level, where cities can do a lot, or NGOs can do a lot to develop transatlantic collaboration. And I think we should do that much more than we maybe have done in the last years. And of course, it will be interesting to follow the elections in the US next year, and hopefully we will do that together, and we will have the possibility to have some discussions like we had tonight. Thanks from my side.
I want to join Rasmus in thanking both you, Julie, and Bastian for the time that you have invested into this conversation and all your contributions and your insights. That has been extremely helpful for the people that have been joining this conference call. I also share Rasmus' conviction that this is going to be one of the most influential and most election with the most far-reaching consequences. If Trump indeed gets re-elected, I fear that he will ruin not only democracy in the United States, he will also ruin what's left of a multilateral world order. And so the basic injustice that we cannot overcome in this election is, of course, that we will all be confronted with the outcome, but we will not all have a voice and a vote in that election. So I hope that you Americans that do have a vote make very qualified use of that. Thanks again for allowing us to have this conversation, and hopefully we will be in touch and share some insights also in the future. So thank you very much, and good evening to everybody, to all those that joined. I hope it was useful for you and fruitful. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take good care of yourself.
Take care.